to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous lecture, we talked about some of the background of the Constitutional Convention, some of the so-called Founding Fathers who were in attendance at the convention, and some of the ideas that underpinned the thinking that went into their debates. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to conclude a discussion of the Constitutional Convention and the final product that they came up with, the Constitution itself. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, debate at the Constitutional Convention raged on for some 4 months. So there were many differences of opinion between the representatives there, between large states and small, slave states and free, and all kinds of other ideas simply about the way government should operate. And yet, at the end of the convention, they did arrive at a number of now famous compromises that made the Constitution possible and made it unique of any other government around the world. So some of the most noteworthy of those I'll mention here, and we're going to get into more detailed discussion about some of these decisions as we go along. The bicameral legislature, one of the most important aspects of our government. The House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate with 2 representatives from each state. Similarly, the famous division of powers between the 3 branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. The process of electing the president, the creation of the so-called electoral college, which of late has become somewhat problematic, frankly, but it certainly creates a unique process for our government. And it might be worth mentioning that not everyone in the convention agreed that there should even be a president, or at least a single president. There were a number of different proposals for a different kind of executive. If we think back to ancient Rome, they were governed by a sort of tri-pronged executive, 3 officials in that office. The election of U.S. senators would be by their state legislatures, so that has changed over time. And finally, to appease the southern states, the so-called 3/5 compromise, which is really the only reference to slavery in the Constitution, that called for slaves being counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. And also laying out that the slave trade would be ended in 20 years. Now it would take, again, 4 months to fully flesh out all of the arguments made during the Constitutional Convention, so I'll hit just a few of the highlights before we engage in some discussion of the Federalist Papers and the aftermath of the convention. But one of those I want to mention was the plan forwarded by Alexander Hamilton, who spoke in the convention on June 18th, after the sides had been debating for a while on the so-called Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, which kind of laid out different arguments based on large states versus small states. Hamilton addressed the assemblage basically making the argument for a strong federal government. There was a lot of discussion about the sovereignty of the states, and Hamilton believed strongly that only a firm federal government could address the issues confronted by the Union. No state alone could successfully defend America from its foreign adversaries. No state alone could handle the different problems that confronted the Union. So Hamilton also proposed a very strong executive in the figure of the president. In fact, his proposal proposed that there would be a president elected for life who would have ultimate veto power over all legislation. He called for great power being placed in the hands of the president. He also made the comment, as far as popular government and so-called democracy, that the people begin to be tired of an excess of democracy. Now, obviously, Hamilton's plan was not adopted, at least not letter for letter. But he did advance this plan for a strong federal government, which ultimately most of the convention came around to. And when we think about his ideas related to the presidency, a few things warrant mention. First of all, obviously, Hamilton just supported a strong executive, but he had also worked with Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was Washington's aide de camp, and he saw how Washington struggled throughout the war to have the needs of the Continental Army met. And so Hamilton understood we needed a strong executive to be able to meet those needs. He also was of the understanding, as many were, that whoever the executive was, the first one would be George Washington himself. And so Hamilton had no fears about imbuing a person like George Washington with the extensive powers that he outlined. Let me also come back to this idea that people would begin to grow tired of an excess of democracy. And it might be worth raising the question, was he right about this? If we think about people in modern America handle the right to vote, think about all of the sort of minor local elections, state elections, different proposals that are put to us to vote, and how many of us actually vote in those lesser elections. Now, sure, most of us manage to drag ourselves to the polls when it comes to electing the president once every 4 years. But is he not right that we've grown a bit tired of the excesses of democracy? What kind of dread do we feel when a summons for jury duty arrives? This is part of our civic duty, and yet none of us, it seems, really embrace this with eagerness. So I think, in fairness to Hamilton, while his comment sounds a bit crass in the modern setting, I think he actually raised a fair point, and in fact many of us have grown somewhat tired of the excesses of democracy. Hamilton's shocking proposal seemed to break through an impasse at the convention, and in the aftermath of that proposal, the two sides set about to at least arrive on some compromises. It was James Madison who really was the chief architect of the Constitution, and he was the man who helped to steer a middle ground between the sides after Hamilton's proposal. Madison argued for some kind of compromise, which ultimately came to be called the Connecticut Compromise, arguing that no republic had ever survived and that no confederation of separate states had survived for long. Inevitably, they would always fall into dispute and disrepair. So between Hamilton's plan, the New Jersey plan, which called for the ultimate sovereignty of state governments, Madison managed to forge a middle ground, although it was still a long, complex, and difficult process. And we're going to be talking about some of the details of the plan in the next few lectures as we talk about the ratification process. But eventually, Madison's plan went to a committee of detail and then a committee of style, which set about to put words to the plan itself, and ultimately the famous preamble, which was written principally by Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Beautifully well written, and it puts well what these men had achieved in writing the Constitution. The Constitution as written in the convention was not perfect, and we're going to talk about some of the amendments and the Bill of Rights to be added to it. But it certainly established some foundational and vital ideas to the survival of our government. Article 4, which essentially mandated the separation of church and states. Article 6, which laid out that the Constitution and the laws of the United States would supersede the laws of the states, and so state sovereignty would not be recognized as such in the Constitution. Now, of course, we will later fight a civil war in part over that idea. But the foundations made in the Constitution were critical and ultimately would survive the test of time. As the convention closed, George Washington, making some final comments, wrote, "Democratical states must always feel before they can see. It is this that makes their government slow, but the people will be right at last." He suggests at this point the Constitution moves to the people for the debate over ratification. And that is the process that follows and the process that we will discuss over the next several lectures.